Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to our lecture series on the global history of capitalism. And today I'm going to be talking about mainly the connections between the origins of global capitalism and slavery. And especially, we're going to look in detail at slavery in 19th century in the 19th century United States. And to help us do that, I'm going to be focusing on a book that came out a while ago. It received a lot of attention, got a lot of fanfare. It's called Slavery's Capitalism: A New History of American Economic Development, edited by Sven, Beckert, and Seth Rockman. And this is a great book. It has a lot of articles, I think maybe 14 chapters, probably all by different scholars, introduction by the editors themselves, and focusing on the connections between slavery in the U.S. and capitalism, and especially highlighting how U.S. slavery was essential for the establishment of capitalism in the U.S. and for the accumulation of capital, and much of capitalism today, not just in the U.S. but globally, is based off of earlier forms of historical slavery, such as this. So in that sense, it's a really, I think it's a great book. It's an important book. And in this talk today, I'm going to try to summarize and maybe give a little bit of analysis of the contents as best as possible in the course of my approximately hour-long talk here. Okay, so to get started, just have my simple PowerPoint here. Slavery's Capitalism, by Sven, Beckert, and Seth Rockman, or edited by, I should say. Okay, and actually, before though getting into the arguments in the book, I feel like a little bit of background, a little bit of exposition is necessary to set the stage here for what is going on, because the editors of the book, in as well and as astutely as they perceive the connections between slavery and capitalism, they don't really ever outline the theoretical debates behind their topic, basically behind the issue of slavery and capitalism. Okay, so I think this is important though, and I want to dedicate one slide to this here. So there's a common stereotypical critique that Marx didn't adequately pay attention to slavery's role in maintaining capitalism. But this is incorrect, and this has been shown by many scholars over many decades, but especially recently, to be quite inaccurate. That Marx, in fact, very well understood that capitalism necessitated slavery, different forms of slavery, and thus viewed slavery's abolition as essential to the fight against capitalism. Marx also wrote prolifically on the issue of slavery, both globally and in the U.S. For example, most famously in his 1864 letter to Abraham Lincoln, congratulating him on his re-election, and encouraging him in the fight against slavery. And Marx understood the necessity as well of forming a global alliance of workers that transcended race. And this is essential to to kind of this materialist view of history, and to understanding class struggle as one of the primary agents in history. Okay, And of course, the abolition of slavery would be necessary for this. And Marx famously wrote in Capital, "Labor in a white skin can't emancipate itself where it is branded in a black skin." Okay, so if one group of workers is enslaved, you can't really have another group of workers somewhere else who can really say that they're free and succeeding in some kind of struggle for workers' liberation, right? And so it's not Marx that was mistaken in his views of slavery, but it was rather the classical liberal political economists themselves who did not accurately perceive the connections between slavery and capitalism. And Adam Smith and others thought that slavery, which they equated to earlier pre-capitalist modes of production, or kind of feudal modes of production, they said was incompatible with capitalist, quote, free wage labor, which they thought was more modern. And many classical political economists and nationalist or abolitionist movements thus valorized in the process capitalist wage labor in their critique of slavery. But what they failed to see is that A, slavery is essential for capitalism, and B, quote, free wage labor is in fact also a kind of slavery. Which brings us back to Marx's important observations on slavery. One, which is that slaves are a kind of constant capital, wherein the price of the slave is based on how much surplus value they are anticipated to produce over the course of a lifetime. So in this sense as well, slaves have exchange value. Now note again, workers will produce value over the course of a lifetime, produce surplus value, and receive a portion of the products of their labor as wages, whereas the rest of it is skimmed off the top as surplus value, which is the source of capitalist profit. And this is, in a sense, anticipated in advance through wages and salaries and pensions and whatnot. But in the case of slaves, it's all a known factor from the beginning. All of this is anticipated, how much a slave is expected to produce from the beginning. And that is the source of capitalist value and profit for the slave owners. And that is what then determines the price of the slave in advance. A second thing that Marx noted about slavery was that there is a global division of labor under capitalism, there was or is, wherein free wage labor in some parts of the world is predicated on unfree forms of slave labor in other parts of the world. And we see this today quite clearly. I don't need to explain to you where most of the products we buy come from, or the conditions that most of the products we buy are produced under, which in many cases is quite terrible. So this is a kind of global division of labor that Marx already perceived as well in the case of slavery. And third, that slave owner capitalism pre-configured other forms of modern industrial capitalism, wherein the plantation manager mirrored the factory or company manager. So all of these different kinds of managerialist practices related to regulating all kinds of, everything about slaves' daily lives and how much they produce, micromanaging everything. This pre-configures, much of this kind of managerial aspect of capitalism that we see today. Much more could be said about this issue, but for the time being, I will direct your attention to a great article in Monthly Review by John Bellamy Foster, Hannah Holloman, and Brett Clark called Marx and Slavery, released in 2020. Great overview of the issues there as well. So let's get into the book. And in the introduction, the authors explain that in this 80-year period between the American Revolution and the Civil War, slavery was essential, indispensable for the economic development of the United States. Why? Well, for many different reasons, but one major one was that slave-grown cotton was the U.S.'s most valuable export, meaning that slaves contained in their bodies, in themselves, more value than all of the railroads and factories in the U.S. put together at that time. And people at the time were aware of the importance of slavery for the U.S. and global economy. They knew the connections between slavery and capitalism. And in prior literature, some of this has already been investigated as well. People knew and saw that slave-grown sugar helped create wealth for the Industrial Revolution. But a lot of this, even though it was common knowledge at the time, was kind of later forgotten, especially in the U.S., argue the authors, because there was this idea that I've already highlighted, partly between of classical political economy, which said that slavery and capitalism were incompatible, that slavery was a pre-capitalist mode of production, and it was unmodern, right? So that was one reason why these connections were forgotten. Another reason is that, of course, in the U.S., various discriminatory racist Jim Crow laws erased black narratives. The Cold War touted free enterprise. A Cold War ideology in that period touted free enterprise, and neoliberalism later, up until quite recently, the dominant paradigm, paraded free market freedoms. So it's just extending this idea, basically, of classical political economy that capitalism and slavery are incompatible, right? Slavery's Capitalism, this book challenges those ideas and those narratives by showing that slavery was essential to the economic development of capitalism in the United States, okay? All right, and it also challenges the idea of this myth of a free North versus an unfree South, okay? Because already think about it. I mean, yeah, you've got the kind of mythical history of these great people in the North, abolitionists, whatever, just they're so concerned about slaves' welfare and they want to, they just want to emancipate black people in the U.S. because just out of the goodness of their own heart or something like that. I mean, that was true, maybe for some people, but the idea of a free North and an unfree versus an unfree South in general is untenable, as we will see. The North was highly invested in the maintenance of U.S. slavery in the South, as was the entire global capitalist economy. Okay, so the authors say that, because of these things and other things as well, that slavery is really a modern institution, and it's a product of modern capitalism. It's not a pre-modern. There are pre-modern forms of slavery. They don't really get into this, of course, but as Marx would say as well, slavery, the most brutal and inhumane types of slavery were developed under capitalism. And that is what I would add is the most kind of modern aspect of the slavery that the authors are looking at here. Slavery relies on the state to maintain itself, as does global capitalism. And this is so interesting as well, that, again, there's this idea, that the free market is somehow independent from the state, but that's a myth, of course. And capitalism as well relies heavily on the interference of the state, as we will see. They show the kind of explosive growth of U.S. cotton here. I don't need to get into this in detail, but it grows massively throughout this period. It was facilitated by new kinds of technology, and it also mirrored the rise of finance capital as well. Slaves were bought on credit, And in many ways, as I've already mentioned, slavery, plantation owners, kind of preconfigured modern managers, factory managers, company managers, in the ways that they attempted to micromanage everything. And slave plantations were the nation's first big businesses, add the authors here. And I also want to point out that, as they mentioned, slavery also relied on pre-capitalist forms of technology too. And this was something that we saw in Andrew Liu's book, T-War. In the case of U.S. slavery, for instance, the whip, the use of this older kind of tool, but used in new, very horrible ways to extract more surplus value from people by getting them to work faster and more and harder. The whip as a tool to extract surplus value. And of course, as we've also mentioned, capitalist technology does not help workers in any way. It's only designed about producing, increasing productivity and efficiency, meaning extracting, a higher rate of surplus value, right? And one example of this is the wheat reaper, as we'll see in a later chapter. The point of the wheat reaper was that it took more labor to operate, but you could harvest more faster. Okay, so it didn't help workers in any way. It's not a labor saver, but a time saver. It required more labor power to operate. So this is illustrative of capitalist technology, right? More about the growth of finance here. Slaves bought and traded on credit. There are speculative credit schemes based on anticipated slave output, because again, the price of slaves is determined by how much surplus value they are anticipated to produce over the course of their productive lifetime, which is also all measured out. How many years is a slave going to be, quote, productive? What are their peak working years? This is this kind of micromanagement as well. So that vast amounts of capital were stored in the bodies of slaves, they write. Also, small farmers would take out mortgage loans on their slaves to buy more slaves. And that sometimes these mortgages totaled more total capital than their whole yearly output of crops. So there were vast amounts of credit used to buy involved in this. Vast amounts of credit were taken out to buy land. And I should mention, recently stolen from Native Americans. Local governments buy shares in banks' slave trade markets and vice versa for government bonds to underwrite the slave economy. So this is this web of credit and finance. In 1837, there was a cotton crash, and many speculators and others defaulted on their loans, but the U.S. Supreme Court protected them to carry on speculative slave finance, and slave owners tried to recoup their losses from early slave deaths through government-protected valuations at the moment of sale. So involvement here between the state, again, protecting the institution of slavery. We'll talk more about this cotton crash later. Many famous banks and companies have their origins in slavery. So we'll talk more about that later. And basically everybody was implicated through their connections in the global capitalist economy. So it's not geographically limited. And this is why it's so important to study capitalism, the global history of capitalism, because it's a global system, right? So the authors say, it's difficult to determine where the slave economy ended and the so-called free economy began. That's a great quote here that illustrates as well this what they also mention, the global division of labor. This kind of really, I think, even summarizes maybe the main point of the book. We'll get into some of this a little bit later, but this last point here is also worth mentioning, that slavery allowed the U.S. allowed U.S. workers, I would say, to remain independent producers for longer, as opposed to Europe, which proletarianized much faster. Okay. So looking at Chapter 1, Toward a Political Economy of Slave Labor, Hands, Whipping Machines, and Modern Power by Edward Baptiste. So he looks at the importance of abstract time and the use of old technology in new ways. So similar to other studies we've looked at in this class. Slavers made up for bottlenecks by working slaves faster and harder. An overseer would, would choose the fastest picker to set the pace for everyone, and he would watch from above. Stragglers would be whipped or shot. So they would be timed and pressed to constantly pick more. And this is exactly this idea of abstract time that we've seen illustrated elsewhere, this inversion of task time and to time task. Of course, as we mentioned, slavery was essential to the growth of capitalism. Slavers, and here I say slavers, it means, slave owners, plantation owners. I just say slavers because it's shorter, easier to type, stole Native American land and brought in 1 million slaves to develop 800,000 square miles of cotton fields in the U.S. South, providing 80% of the cotton sold in England. There was huge credit and speculation investment in slaves, so that slave bodies were a big store of capital. The southern region of the U.S. became one of the world's 10 largest economies and the 4th most prosperous. U.S. planters, slavers, were the richest people in the U.S. So all of this illustrating how it's essential, slavery is essential not just for the U.S. domestic economy at the time, but the global economy as well. There was a big boom in output through labor-intensive means, as you can see here in 1805. 20 million pounds of cotton produced in 1860, 2 billion pounds. This is a 10,000% increase. The number of cotton slaves at this time also grew exponentially from 50,000 to 2 million. The average picker in 1801, the average cotton picker would pick 28 pounds of cotton a day, whereas in 1846, the average picker would pick 341 pounds a day. So this is raising productivity, which means working harder and faster. It was an increased intensity of labor through these kind of use of different kinds of pre-capitalist technologies like the whip, but used in new ways, and this application of abstract time onto the picking process. And when slavery ended in 1865, there was a huge drop in productivity despite technological advances. So keep this in mind as well when you hear, people today talking about how increasing productivity, when they talk about increasing productivity as a good thing. Keep in mind that historically, when slavery was abolished, productivity declined. Okay, just keep that in mind. Okay. I've talked about some of this. This abolitionists and liberals at the time used ideas of classical political economy to argue against slavery. They valorized the capitalist free market by saying that free wage labor is more, quote, modern and productive than antiquated, quote, unproductive slavery. Note that this is not necessarily a moral argument either, but they failed to see that the real source of wealth is labor, power, and surplus value extracted through brutal beatings, etc. And they also do not understand that slavery, in fact, was often very productive and efficient, in addition to these other critiques which I've already examined. The use of old technology in new capitalist ways, as I've mentioned, the whip, quotas, beatings, etc. Slaves had individual picking quotas, so if they picked too little, they would be whipped. But if they picked a lot, then the quota itself would be raised. And so productivity in this way rose 400% between the 1800s and the 1860s. Further illustrating the connections between slavery and the global economy, as cotton output boomed, the consumers benefited from lower cotton prices, so people bought so many new cotton goods, like clothes, that they required a new room in the house, the closet. And fashion and advertising as well emerged to sell these new clothes. So whole new transformed social relations and industries arising from slavery. In 1807, the U.S. and Great Britain banned the overseas transport of slaves, but they continued to Brazil and Cuba on a huge scale, and the domestic slave trade boomed in the U.S. as slaves moved to the new frontier regions. And the total number of enslaved people at this time grew as well. And of course, Cuban slaves were essential for the global capitalist economy because they produced sugar, while Brazilian slaves produced coffee. And most of the coffee and sugar this time were coming from these two places. Okay. In Chapter 2, Slavery, Scientific Management, Masters, and Managers by Caitlin Rosenthal investigates how plantation owners kind of preconfigured the modern manager. And so, again, she views slavery as a modern capitalist institution. Slave owners diligently kept records of how much slaves picked and tried to improve output and efficiency. They used modern accounting techniques, and as I've said, were early forms of managers. So they would use diaries, and she looks especially, Caitlin Rosenthal looks especially at the diary and account records of one slave owner, Eli Campbell, between 1842 to 1867. He used methods invented by developed by Thomas Affleck, who created a special account book for planters, and he had previously worked as a bookkeeper for the Bank of Scotland. In that account book, it included a place to write down stocks, ledgers, and a dating record, all in one place. It would culminate in a yearly balance sheet. There was also places to write out the daily record of cotton picked per slave as well. So this anyway, just micromanaging kind of every aspect of business, right? There was also the adoption of standardized methods. I would say this is similar to what we've discussed as market imperatives and used to determine the price of slaves, land, etc. in a national global economy. One example was the prime field hand, who was the best picker, who would set the standard against which all other slaves would be measured. And this would determine the price and the value of the slaves as well, how much they're anticipated to pick or produce in a given amount of time based on the standard, which was set at a very high bar based on, the best picker who picked the most. And this also determined as well land value, e.g. the task acre was a land unit whose value was determined by what the prime picker could accomplish. So how much land, what's the land value of a certain plot of land? Well, how much cotton can it be expected to produce? And all of that is based on how much and how fast the best picker can pick from that, right? That's the connection between land value. There's also the use of modern science and media, such as data sharing through planters' periodicals, which focused on improvement and productivity. Not to mention the micromanagement of slaves' diets, focusing on which foods were the cheapest and most nutritious for labor, and all kinds of other calculations being shared by slave owners through different periodicals, such as tallying the total value of human capital, appreciation and depreciation, etc. Just to get an idea of how the value of slaves and depreciation and appreciation on the slaves as a capital investment was calculated, this over the course of slaves' lives, their value would evolve. So as children grew to adults, their value would increase, and etc. Of course, as I'll mention later, female slaves were valued for their reproductive value. So all kinds of different things here going on. I mean, just talking about value in this way in regards to human beings is difficult to do. But again, this is the application of these modern capitalist kind of management and accounting methods in the case of slavery. And in this way, precise means of accounting in the South became more advanced than those in the North. So this idea of slavery as a backwards pre-capitalist feudal institution just do not hold water. In Chapter 3, in International Harvest, the Second Slavery, the Virginia-Brazil Connection, the Development of the McCormick Reaper, Daniel Rood looks at the development of one piece of technology, new technology, applied to harvesting cotton and with the use of slaves. And this was the McCormick Reaper. A reaper is not for cotton, it's for, in this case, harvesting grain for flour. So a reaper is a machine that I'm not a farmer, by the way, so I have no idea if this is correct, but I'm assuming it just cuts the wheat stalks, okay? It cuts the wheat stalks. It's used to harvest grain for flour. That's the new piece of technology, this big machine, which does this. The background to this was that Richmond, Virginia, a Confederate state, a slave-owning state, exported tons of grain, flour to Brazil. And this is all slave grown. There was this development of this large industrial agriculture that emerged around this industry in Brazil as well, for intensification of production for export. The McCormick Reaper was invented in this milieu by Cyrus McCormick. He was part of a group of scientific agriculturists who focused on new tech and, quote, improvement techniques to boost productivity, they focused especially on the mechanization of threshing wheat in Virginia. They wanted to get the harvest out quicker. Farmers wanted to get their harvest out quicker, get it to market before their competitors, right? Because that's where money was made in this kind of flour grain market, I guess. So these things, this kind of competition, it facilitated the growth of big agriculture, centralization, pushing smaller farmers out of business, and bigger farms. And new pieces of technology emerged from this context to accommodate these huge kind of industrial farms that are emerging, and one of these was the Reaper in 1831. They also desired, of course, speed and a constant, I think it should be pace of production, and that could overcome difficulties such as bad weather. And as I mentioned, the Reaper was designed for large farms with mass produce and a surplus of workers. But the machine, the McCormick Reaper, required more labor power. It was not a labor saver because it harvested so much grain, first of all, that people struggled to keep up with it, the people who would work behind it to try to bale all the wheat, for instance. So it's not a labor saver. It was just a time saver. Okay, that's the really important thing here, because increasing the rate of surplus value as well as getting the grain to market before competitors. This is what the technology facilitates. It does not make things in any way easier for workers. And I would say this is how capitalist technology in general works. Okay, neighbor to neighbor, Chapter 4, neighbor to neighbor capitalism, local credit networks, and the mortgaging of slaves. In this chapter, Bonnie Martin focuses on slavery as a system of finance. Sorry, I had to take a drink of water here. Slaves were bought and sold on credit, especially especially loans taken out on slaves were used to support further agricultural expansion. So slave property was valuable and highly liquid. She looks at, and Bonnie Martin looks at over 10,000 loans in which slaves served as collateral. Much of this capital, she found, was raised locally, meaning that neighbors borrowed from neighbors and neighbors lended to neighbors through local credit networks. Sometimes the value of these slave loans was more than the total yearly produce, so it was a lot of fictitious capital being traded in this way. Slaves were bought on credit, paid off through installment plans, so that even poor farmers could own slaves. Let's see. Children were susceptible to multiple mortgages because their value increased over time. So slave credit was highly disruptive for slaves' lives, of course. Free people of color also participated in this by mortgaging their slaves too, or serving as guarantors on others' loans. In slave economies, there is a high percentage of equity mortgages, meaning in this case mortgages that are borrowed, that borrowers give on property already owned, such as land or slaves, on equity mortgages using slaves as collateral, whereas other national economies at this time used land. This is especially true on the frontier, where land initially had a low value. So this is frontier territory in the U.S., territory recently taken or captured through different wars or genocides of Native Americans. And there's so much land that had a very low value. So it didn't really serve as a great basis for taking out a mortgage for a loan. But slaves' bodies were very valuable and had in big stores of capital, so they were mainly used as in equity mortgages. But as land values rose, more and more land was used for mortgages eventually. But anyway, there's a colonial pattern of reliance on slaves as collateral, she says. Where there was a high demand for slave labor, there was more purchase money mortgages, and more lenders were usually fellow residents rather than institutions. Okay, so this is a kind of unique thing that she notes about slave finance at this time. This was especially true in the frontier. Community lending networks enabled capital to stay active even during periods of instability and crisis when banks restricted lending. Okay. Yeah, and then I'll just skip to the end here. So she notes that this was very disruptive for slaves' lives, obviously, when they're used as collateral in taking out loans for slave owners, because when slave owners defaulted their collateral, the slaves themselves would be confiscated and slave families would be torn apart. In Chapter 5, The Contours of Cotton Capitalism, Speculation, Slavery, and the Economic Panic in Mississippi, 1832 to 1841, Joshua Rothman investigates the speculative credit bubble of the 1830s based on the cotton boom. Through the example, he highlights of especially Jesse Mabry, a planter who borrowed huge loans and bought big plantations at the time. So the background to the speculative bubble was that in the 1830s, cotton was the U.S.'s most important export. And most of this cotton came from Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, where credit was just flowing in to fund the booming cotton industry. And much of this was based on slave collateral, as we saw in the last chapter, was all based as well on the profitability or productivity of cotton. So this fueled the speculation and influx of capital, fueled more grueling labor and violence towards slaves, again, because it's predicated, all of this credit is predicated on how much they can pick. And then there was the panic of 1837 when the bubble collapsed. And there was lots of land speculation and a bubble all over the country, fueled by easy bank loans and deregulation. This boom was especially huge in the slave and cotton South and Southwest, where cotton prices and exports and cotton land values soared through the 1830s. The U.S. had 2/3 of the global cotton market, and the U.S. South had 80% of this, most going to England to produce manufacturing goods like clothes. The best land was in Mississippi, which I mentioned, which was recently stolen from Native Americans. The U.S. government sold off the stolen land as private property. Much of it was bought with loans fueled by the proliferation of new banks, and investors flocked from around the world to pump money into the cotton industry. But the banks didn't actually hold all this cash on hand. Much of it was based on promised rather than actual holdings. And as borrowers, quote, bought land on credit, then mortgages were taken out to borrow more credit from another bank. So there was no way that the actual cotton crop or profit could keep up with this, what Rothman calls a debt-fueled delirium. But people tried, nevertheless, with a massive import of slave labor so that the slave population tripled in a 10-year period. The problem, of course, was that it was based on speculative output and mortgaged values of slaves, and lots of this was done on credit through local connections, not just through banks. This was done by slave traders who sold slaves on credit. So slaves were brutalized to work harder, but they can't keep up with all the speculative demand, which means that the whole foundation for borrowing, slave labor, is itself incredibly shaky. And if the slave died, for instance, then output would go down, an asset or value would be lost, and somebody would be left holding debt. The borrower would be left holding debt. So there was attempts actually to control the debt bubble by ensuring the quality of slaves. And Mississippi banned the slave trade import, or the import of slaves from out of state in an attempt to try to contain the speculative bubble, which was being met by importing massive amounts of slaves, right? But white slavers ignored this law, basically, because everyone's debts and futures were wrapped up in slaves. And they became paranoid then about slave revolts, about all of their capital investment suddenly turning against them. And this resulted in vigilantes intimidating more violence on blacks. And as Rothman says, white control over this was a form of white control over the most important form of capital in the region. So then when the speculative bubble collapsed in 1837, property values plummeted and there was mass bankruptcy. And this kind of started in 1936 when federal surpluses were redistributed among states based on their numerical representation in Congress. So Mississippi had low representation in Congress, meaning that it got lower federal surpluses. And also President Jackson at the time required federal land purchases to be made in gold or silver, not on credit. So you can see how this would impact the speculative bubble in Mississippi. This scared investors who raised interest rates and restricted credit, and then cotton prices tumbled. After the crash, planters tried to sell their most valuable assets, slaves, or to run off with their slaves. Slave prices dropped dramatically. And meanwhile, instead of regulating the banks, however, the government tried to increase credit and lending again and create more banks. So lots of bonds were backed by state credit at this time then. Banks also pushed for a ban on bringing more slaves into the state, since this resulted in an outflow of capital and an increase in debts, the amount loaned by state banks, and also to prevent planters from buying or borrowing beyond their means. But this ban would have implications for states' rights to regulate commerce through their borders. If one state outlawed slavery, for instance, they could confiscate other slaves' property, which were considered property, transported through their borders. Thus, this became a constitutional issue related to one of the fundamental building blocks of liberalism itself, property rights. Meanwhile, Northern abolitionists used the 1837 crash, as evidence that slavery was a financial danger to the national economy. So they understand very well how important slavery is for the national economy. And partly this is because it was mostly lots of northern banks were funding slavery. So when there were mass bankruptcies, these northern banks became the largest slaveholders. Okay, need to take another drink here. Chapter 6, Broad is the road that leads to death, human capital and enslaved mortality. In this chapter, Deanna Ramey Berry focuses on how the effects of slavery continued beyond the grave, specifically how slave owners filed for compensation when one of their slaves died. This meant that slaves had value even after death, and they had value before life too, since female slaves were valued for their reproductive abilities. Especially in cases of suicide, slave owners would file for compensation. But the author, Ramey Berry, also notes that suicide was a means for slaves to protest their commodification in some cases. But in any case, this didn't really end because there were quibbles over their posthumous value, which would continue for years in courts. And moreover, when other non-owners beat someone else's slaves to death, the slave owners would sue for property damages. So this is an instance as well where the state is required to come in and use the law to protect private property, which reinforces slavery. But slave suicide does lead some planters or investors to consider the financial stability of their investment and thus indirectly recognize slaves' humanity. Moreover, life insurance emerged as a way to protect slavers' investments. Some slave owners turned to the state for compensation, and this was true when slaves would die in public work projects as well. And then sometimes slave owners would kill their slaves because their assessed insurance value was more than their actual value. So this is just, she highlights many different examples of how value could extend beyond life or death. It was more important than the actual life of the slave, and as well as highlighting here how the state and the law is used to reinforce slavery through liberal ideas of private property. In Chapter 7, August Belmont and the World the Slaves Made, Kathryn Boodry looks at the financial history of slavery. The biggest involvement in the global capitalism and slavery was the export-import of slave-produced commodities, especially cotton, for manufacturing in England. As I mentioned, cotton was the primary U.S. export at the time, and Great Britain was the largest consumer. And slavery, much of U.S. slavery, was financed by credit, which not just came from local credit networks or northern banks, but a lot of it from big banks in London as well. And one of those big bankers was banking families was the Rothschilds, and their representative in the U.S. or their agent in the U.S. was August Belmont. And he wrote and advised the Rothschilds on issues relating to the U.S. economy and how best to invest their money in the U.S. economy. Great Britain, of course, had huge reason to invest, of course, as I've shown, because it was the major importer of U.S. cotton. So how did this system of lending and investment work? Well, banks would sell planters' property, who then bought it on loan at a mortgage of 2/3 the value of the property. Banks then issued bonds backed by this mortgage pool and sold them for working capital in money markets in New York and London. Planters then borrowed from this fund, pledging their crops as securities. So it was all based on crop price stability, not to mention the productivity of slaves picking cotton. And advances on cotton usually were 2/3 the anticipated market value of yield. Factors and merchant bankers then purchased the crops with commission fees. So this was where capitalists, or capital and money, was made in this system. It was through these commission fees, through the banks basically, who are doing all of the lending and then holding the securities and mortgages and whatnot. As they handle those things, they extract commission fees. That's the simple explanation, right? After the 1837 crash, big banks with cash on hand could move in and clean up house, basically, and prices and competition were so low that they could just buy up much of the market. Belmont at this time advised the Rothschilds to buy after the crash, but his employer was more cautious. Belmont also wanted to hold consignments and issue advances on future sales, while Rothschilds would rather purchase cotton outright. And the Rothschilds were always cautious about the cotton trade and moved away from it after 1849, but they did profit from the cotton trade and used what they learned in the later gold business. In Chapter 8, What Do We Have to Do with Slavery? New Englanders and the Slave Economies of the West Indies, Eric Kimball investigates the connections between, New England and the slave economies of the West Indies. New Englanders carried goods and slaves between the West Indies, Great Britain, and New England in the 18th century. So they may not have owned many slaves directly, because New England is in the north of the United States, where they did not technically have slavery legally, but they were still involved in the slave trade, okay? They may not have owned many slaves directly, but they're still influenced and participated in the slave trade. And he focuses on the interconnections through global capitalism and commodity production and trade. He first looks at the 17th century, and this time New England colonies were poor. They traded goods with the West Indies and then traded these for English commodities, which had a high demand in New England. So much so that New England ran up a general trade deficit with England. New England then gets a trade surplus trading with the West Indies and can use this to pay its deficit with England. I'll explain in a second here, but New England also transported slaves across the Atlantic between 1645 and 1808. Ships from Africa went to the West Indies, and also ships brought slaves to the U.S. South. Rhode Islanders, in particular, Rhode Island, a part of New England, in particular, owned ships. They used rum to trade for slaves between 11 million gallons to Africa between 1709 and 1807. Rum was manufactured with slave-grown sugar and molasses from the West Indies. New England also traded whale oil to the West Indies for lamps to use to keep sugar factories running and provide cod or fish for slaves to eat. So I just made a brief, kind of simple little chart here, but basically New England is bringing cotton and sugar. It's getting cotton and sugar from the West Indies, and it's exchanging hemp and trading hemp and fish in exchange. These things also used in the slave slave production there, and then trading that cotton and sugar to England. And I should have added here getting manufactured goods back from England as well. So this is how by kind of this arbitrage, they are able to kind of support themselves. New England traders are able to support themselves because they have a trade deficit with England, but a surplus with the West Indies. And at the same time, as I've mentioned here, New England is bringing slaves actually from New England. English boats are bringing slaves from Africa to the West Indies in the U.S. South as well. New England also provided cattle for West Indies sugar plantations as well as lumber. New England prohibited trade with the West Indies after the 1776 independence. U.S. gained its independence from England because the West Indies were English colonies. But John Adams and others in the U.S. encouraged smuggling because the West Indies was critical to the U.S. economy. So even though, again, at this time, parts of the West Indies are colonies of England, so America fights a war of independence with England, and during that time, it's not supposed to trade with the West Indies, but it continues to do so anyway because that trade is critical for the U.S. economy. Eventually, the U.S. builds a surplus, re-exporting slave-produced goods from European West Indies colonies back to Europe. This allowed rich U.S. capitalists to amass fortunes that fueled the later manufacturing boom. Chapter 9 is called No Country But Their Counting Houses, the U.S.-Cuba Baltic Circuit 1809-1812 by Stephen Chambers. So this is kind of building off of the last chapter, and New England increasingly was involved in the Cuban slave trade in the West Indies, and even many New Englanders even owned plantations there. The U.S. transported goods from Spanish slave colonies back to Spain and thus ran a trade surplus. So the U.S. is just basically conducting arbitrage, essentially, between Europe and its colonies in the West Indies. And U.S. bankers use this surplus and the surplus from slave cotton exports to finance loans from London banks to finance expansion of the Cuban slave frontier. So it's a whole interconnected system anyway here. But there's some political, history, important history here that influenced this. During the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon banned imports from European colonies under the continental system. John Quincy Adams was the U.S.'s ambassador to Russia, and he oversaw the illegal import of slave colony sugar and coffee to Russia, which most came from Cuba and then would be funneled into Europe through Russia. So to profit from European warfare, the U.S. creates a U.S.-Cuba-Russia trade of coffee, cotton, sugar, and smuggles those goods during the Napoleon to Europe. During the Napoleonic Wars, U.S. ships were barred from European ports, so they sailed to Russia instead. Okay, so Napoleon has banned U.S. ships from European ports. It's banned European countries from importing goods from certain colonies. Okay, but the U.S., basically what it does here, the U.S. government and private industry smuggles goods from the West Indies colonies to Europe through Russia. But because this was such high risk, New England merchants relied on the protection of the U.S. government and diplomats as well, and military as well, I should say. So you have the U.S. military here basically directly protecting private industry in the U.S. and the whole U.S. government involved in a giant smuggling operation, essentially, so that U.S. foreign diplomacy in this case is very clearly revealed to be just about making money. Okay, yeah, I'll just kind of skip ahead a little bit here. There's also a U.S. consul, quote, consul in Cuba, which worked to secure consignments for U.S. merchants, because I say consul in quotes here because rather than diplomatic engagements, it was mostly just engaged again in making money and protecting U.S. merchants. After the U.S. law banned building slave ships, American merchants moved their slave trade operations to Cuba. Then in 1808, the U.S. banned the Atlantic slave trade while Spain sought to expand it. Cuba's Spanish colony at this time. So the U.S. merchants relied on Cuban slaves, but now they had no or little to no U.S. government protection, so U.S. merchants and planters in Cuba were subject to violence from Spanish merchants, but U.S. elites tied to each other. U.S. elites, such as politicians and businesses, were tied to each other, so they continued to be the unofficial consul merchants in Cuba. When the Spanish Empire began to crumble, the Creole elite in Cuba pushed for independence or for the U.S. to annex it, but the U.S. relied on weak Spanish rule to conduct the illicit slave trade. So it's a whole kind of complex geopolitics going on here, but it's all about making money through the slave trade, basically. In Chapter 10, The Coastwise Slave Trade and a Mercantile Community of Interest, Calvin Schermerhom looks at the slave trade finance through the lens of slave ships, which he calls floating engines of capitalism. Actually, sorry, he's citing from someone else, but basically that's what he calls them. So slave ships also hauled other consumer goods, such as cotton, and slavers would kidnap free blacks in the north and illegally transport them south as well. Merchants also eventually became bankers, lending out credit and trading foreign and domestic bills of exchange. Shopping connects them to information. I should say this should be shipping. Connects them to an information system in an age before credit reports. And much of this also depends on how timely goods can be shipped, the health of markets, the ability of buyers to pay off loans, etc. So ships play this important function, right? They not only ship a bunch of goods and slaves and whatnot, slave-produced goods, but they also carry information, okay? So one ship was the Unicorn, which transported ships and goods between the North and the South. Much of the goods were for cotton and sugar production, also coffee, tea, etc., all slave-grown. I'm going to kind of skip over some of this, actually. He shows how, different kind of big banking houses, like how they buy up ships in some cases, how different slavers and financiers, hire ships to ship slaves for them, and the owners of the ships exact a transport fee for each slave. He looks at different ships here, the Almy, the Lapwig, and yeah, okay. Chapter 11 is called War and Priests, Catholic Colleges and Slavery in the Age of Revolution by Craig Stephen Wilder. He focuses on Catholic universities' support for slavery in the U.S., and especially looks at Georgetown University in Maryland, which was a Jesuit college. many priests owned slaves and slave plantations, and these plantations funded the university. So that's the basic gist of this chapter. Jesuits arrived, and then he gives some background. So the Jesuits arrived in Maryland in 1633 to try to, spelling error again, should be convert Native Americans to Christianity, but they faced persecution from Protestants and were kicked out. So note, at this time, U.S. colonies were still English territories, and priests faced death penalty for coming to the colonies. Harvard University was vehemently anti-Catholic, and in New York, Catholic priests could be executed. I'm just going to kind of summarize the contents of this chapter, not really following the PowerPoint so strictly, just out of concerns of time. But basically, for background here, we have conflict, first of all, between Catholics and Protestants, which was going on in Europe and especially in England at the time. And American colonies at this point were English territories, so Catholics were persecuted in those territories, right? They weren't really allowed to operate freely there. So a lot of Catholics then made up for this by relying on slavery even more heavily to kind of overcome their own persecution, I guess, right? And as I write here, in fact, slavery allowed Catholics to survive in the British Atlantic. Okay, so they're heavily involved in slavery. And as many famous Catholics like Charles Carroll, priests like Charles Carroll, for instance, pushed to end discrimination against themselves and called for independence, individual liberty, and freedom of religion, they simultaneously supported slavery. Okay, so they did not apply those arguments that they made for themselves to slaves. Well, the situation changed a bit during the U.S. War of Independence because the U.S., at this point then, the colonies were fighting against England. And now the U.S. colonies then want to enact the support of Catholics, not least because France and Spain and some European countries are predominantly Catholic, and they supported the U.S. in its war against England. So this results in some transformation of the position of Catholics in the United States then eventually, and it leads them eventually to kind of not rely so much on slavery in certain parts, especially to support, for instance, Georgetown College in Maryland. So at first, when they relied heavily on slavery there, the first 40 years of that college had free tuition. And that was only possible because all of that was financed with the debts and the labor of slaves. But even after the position of Catholics improved in the U.S. a bit, and they relied less on slavery in the East Coast, Catholics and Jesuits, and even who then also operate universities like Georgetown, they still relied heavily in the past on slavery, and they continue to pursue slavery through the westward expansion, so into the west of the U.S. Chapter 12 is called Capitalism, Slavery, and the New Epoch, Matthew Carey's 1819 by Andrew Shankman. Matthew Carey was a major advocate of the slave economy, and he critiqued the New England Federalists who critiqued Southern slavery. And Carey said that slavery was essential to unite the nation. And he attacked the New England Federalists as being hypocritical because they relied on slavery too. And he wrote a publication called The Olive Branch, in which he advocated his ideas. And he said that Northerners should unite with the South and enforce slavery. So he thought that the formation of a slave economy would be a defining feature of the U.S., and it would be something that would unite the North and the South. He was afraid of the instability of global markets, and he wanted to build a strong domestic market. He especially wanted to raise domestic produce and to reduce the U.S.'s reliance on foreign imports. He was critical of capitalists and advocated equality, and especially he held up the interests of the middle class, but of course he was very nationalistic as well in this process. He was a Jeffersonian Republican, which was mostly about enabling all men to participate in capitalism rather than just a handful of wealthy oligarchs. It was all about promoting, quote, men of moderate fortune. But his vision all depends on the use of slavery. I see a lot of kind of the origins of many contemporary ideas in the U.S. and U.S. conservatism today in some of this Jeffersonian Republican kind of views of, especially the idea of enabling all men to participate in capitalism, right? That's really what equality kind of means for a lot of conservatives, I think, in the U.S. So that kind of older, conservative idea, in a way, still kind of exists at a certain level in the U.S. But of course, Kerry's vision was all dependent on the use of slavery, and Kerry wanted as well the government to create national banks. So he called for a large government role in the economy and supporting the slave economy as well. He wanted the government to create national banks, roads, canals, public works, etc. And however, many slave owners and planters don't like Kerry's ideas, even though he's calling for the centrality of slavery to the U.S. economy. Slave owners don't like his ideas because they predicated the use of a strong national government. And slave owners didn't like this because they advocated states' rights instead. And the reason was very simple, because if the government could enact laws above states' rights, then they could also easily impact slavery or even create a law eventually that would outlaw slavery, right? And Kerry acknowledged that slavery was wrong, evil, and contradictory, but he felt that the national interest was more important, and that that American freedom or liberty must be protected at all costs. Of course, freedom and liberty here defined in a very narrow sense. Slavery for him was a better alternative to losing these things. He was very racist and viewed whites as superior, so their freedom for him was, quote, more important. And he thought that free blacks had no place in his new republic because their presence would undermine the institution of slavery. Okay, my throat is getting quite parched here, so I'm going to keep taking profuse drinks of water, but we're almost to the end of this talk. In Chapter 13, The Market, Utility, and Slavery in Southern Legal Thought, Alfred Brophy looks at the role of the law in enforcing slavery, and especially the role of Southern jurists, judges, right? An aside here is that many Southern slavers critiqued the free market by saying that their black slaves were treated better than white wage workers, and they also argued that African blacks were happy under slavery. So this is what many Southern slave owners said. And the law at the time reinforced slavery by considering slaves as private property. There was a pro-slavery law of the market, says Brophy. So the key basis for liberal law is private property, and this is why this is such a fundamental of such fundamental importance here in the connections between slavery and capitalism. And note here Marx's chapter in Capital, Volume 1, The Law as Such, where he notes as well that the law, that private property is the glue of modern liberal nation states, and that states, mainly exist to protect this law, to protect private property. So if slavery was abolished, it would invite attacks on other private property, forms of private property, and soon, horror of horrors, could even lead to communism. Moreover, North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Thomas Ruffin recognized in 1830 that slaves would never accept their subordinate position in Southern morality, and thus violence was necessary to enforce slavery, he argued. And this is all, again, it goes back to this fundamental belief in the sanctity of private property and characterizing slaves as private property. Much of Southern judges' reasoning was very utilitarian. Slavery was necessary if it was for the greater good, they thought. Laws also prohibited slaves from working for themselves because this would undermine the institution of slavery. So they were utilitarian because the owner's wishes, even if the owner wanted to free their slaves, were subordinate still to the larger community. Southern judges also privately loved and upheld the free market, even though they critiqued it in defense of slavery. For example, worker slaves' injuries were not the responsibility of the owner or employer. But some liabilities, such as the fellow servant rule, where corporations were not responsible for worker safety, did not apply to slaves and slave owners. Because if slavers weren't responsible to some degree, they could undermine private property and slavery. Slavers also couldn't free their slaves unless out of state. Sorry, this is kind of convoluted, but what I want to say here is that generally at this time, companies didn't have a responsibility to secure workers' safety or to give them compensation, let's say, if they were injured on the job. But this doesn't totally, and that was, considered like to be an important characteristic of the, quote, free market at the time. But this didn't totally apply to slaves, because if owners did arbitrarily, punish or even beat their slaves to death, that could simultaneously impact the sanctity of private property. So there was this kind of inconsistency, I guess, and a balancing act that Southern jurists played within their own legal reasoning. Okay. Chapter 14, the last chapter. Why did Northerners oppose the expansion of slavery? Economic Development and Education in the Limestone South by John Majowski. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Probably not. So the North benefited from slavery too. But then why did most Northern Republicans oppose slavery? Well, most of it stemmed from the original classical critique of classical political economy that had this idea that slavery and capitalism, or free wage labor, slavery and capitalism were incompatible, and that free wage labor is more productive and efficient than slavery. This is, again, a myth, and it's not entirely true, but this is what most classical political economists, especially at the time, thought. And so this is why, one big reason why people in the North, even Republicans, oppose slavery. But the South also innovated and modernized, even and developed a diverse economy even with slavery, shows Majowski. But they didn't develop education as much as the North, and he does say this did stifle innovation. So I actually, to be honest, I was a little confused by this last chapter. The author seems to indicate the inconsistencies of classical political economy's views towards slavery, but then at the same, he says, and most of the other chapters in this volume show that, slavery, it's essential for capitalism. It can actually be very productive, but productivity itself is not necessarily a good thing. It can be very deadly. But then the author at the end kind of says slavery did in a way hinder parts of the South's development. So I don't really know. I wasn't totally convinced by this last chapter, to be honest. So Majowski focuses on the Limestone South, which is a region of the South that had good soil and slavery. So it was comparable in terms of, different factors of agricultural production to climates of the North. But the only variable was that this limestone region in the South had slavery, whereas the North didn't. So he can compare their productive output a little bit better. And then it's easier to determine what is attributable to slavery and what is not, he says. That's the basis for his argument. And the limestone South developed a diverse economy with yeoman farmers, artisans, merchants, etc. So it wasn't just planters and slavers. And the presence of free laborers there didn't undermine slavery either. And the bluegrass regions even developed industries like hemp, whiskey, and etc. So the limestone South produced more than 2 times the value per person than the rest of the South. So he says that slavery is not a barrier to industrialization. Still, I think that what this really shows is that the free market wage labor really does produce more value than slave labor. But anyway, and that, let's see, what am I trying to argue here? But he says one difference. Anyway, so the bluegrass regions and the limestone South, they had slavery, they had free wage labor, side by side together, and it was compatible and it was fine, and levels of productivity were generally compatible or comparable with the North. But there was one difference, he says, and this was education. And education in these southern regions still lagged far behind those of similar northern regions. And one reason, he says, is that bluegrass schools got less money from taxes, so tuition there was prohibitively expensive. As of 1847, only 2% of kids aged 5 through 19 could attend school there. So his key point is to show how slavery hindered a greater democratization of education. Counties with the most slaves tended to charge the most for education, and he says this affected innovation in the South. Mostly the South just subsidized elite institutions. It reflects an elitist view that, quote, enlightenment should start at the top. But this led Northerners to critique Southerners as ignorant, and Northern news compared Southern whites to serfs, and it demonstrated to them how slavery was harmful to the economy. Okay, skipping ahead. So slavery was compatible with industrialization in northern climates, he says. It could have taken hold in the North, but it would have likely restricted access to education and made society more hierarchical and less egalitarian for non-slave owning poor whites. It would have undermined Northern capitalist beliefs in social mobility, so this is why Northern Republicans oppose. I mean, I guess this makes sense, and I don't know. I mean, yeah, like, it seems a little bit like he's falling back on this argument of classical political economy that slavery hinders the development of productive forces under capitalism, which again is not true, as I've argued throughout this entire PowerPoint. But I don't know. I mean, this is the findings of his analysis. So does it fit in line with the other arguments presented in the essays in this volume? I don't know. Maybe it depends on how you look at it, I guess. But I still found it to be an interesting essay, I should add. And I learned a lot of stuff from all of these essays. And maybe this is where I will conclude here anyway, since I don't have a concluding slide. But I think, as I said, I learned a lot from all of these essays. I'm not an historian of American history of this time period per se, so it was a good kind of way for me to learn about this important period of history, and anyway, to demonstrate the important conclusion of the book and the main point, I guess, of all of the essays in the book, that slavery was fundamental for the onset of global capitalism, for the accumulation of capital, and not just in the process of primitive accumulation, but that slavery itself was a modern institution, and it was capitalist ideas and different kind of capitalist modes of production applied to the institution of slavery, which made it particularly brutal and horrific in this case. And I would add that some of the important findings of this, they're so important because in many ways, this kind of, free labor, the myth of free labor itself is, of course, wage labor is not free in any sense, but even more than that, in the sense of a global division of labor, that capitalism today continues to be predicated on uses of unfree slave labor around the globe, most of which is just pushed out of sight of us here, of consumers such as ourselves in the global north. So that's some of the significance of the work ongoing today, I would say, as well. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and definitely, if you have a chance, pick up this volume, Slavery's Capital. So thanks for listening.